Hello, welcome to Chapter 5, Ambiguous Words and Phrases. And this is for the class Humanities 140, Critical Thinking in the Modern Age. So before we get to the ambiguity, we want to talk about meaning. And there are two kinds of meaning. The first kind is the explicit meaning. This is the precise and clearly expressed meaning, or readily observable. So there's a few examples here. He is 5 foot 9 inches tall and weighs 160 pounds. A car has 4 tires. There are 24 hours in a day. You are getting a 3% raise. Those kinds of meanings are explicit because they describe something in a very objective, concrete way. So if you look at this advertisement on the right-hand side bottom, you'll see a person's feet and a little toe tag that says smoking kills. So the question really is there any doubt what this advertisement is saying? And, it's pretty much in your face. If you smoke, you will die. The other kind of meaning is implicit meaning. And this means that a message is not obvious. It is implied. It requires interpretation. Some people might call this subtext, something going on underneath the explicit meaning. So if you look at this advertisement, you can look at it and say, what are they promoting? So you have a guy who is cleaning the ceiling fan with a Swiffer-like item, and his supposedly or ostensibly wife and child are watching. So you could take the meaning that this Swiffer thing is so easy a man can use it. Just kidding. Or if you look really closely, you'll notice that he only has one arm. And so, again, you could say it's so easy, even a one-armed guy can use it. And essentially what it does is it gives us the ability to interpret it through the filter that we have inside of ourselves. A lot of people see this ad and don't even notice the guy is missing his arm because what they're seeing is an interracial family. So there's a lot going on in this picture that is not explicitly defined in the advertisement. So here's a picture that kind of represents implicit meaning. It's an interpretation. Some of you may have seen a woman looking in the mirror. Others of you may have seen a skull right away. If you look hard enough, you can see both images. And what this means is that we each have a different filter. So these filters that we use to experience the world are impacted by how we grew up, the way we see the world, whether we're optimistic or pessimistic, whether we have experience in various and sundry things that allow us to embrace a particular perspective. Somebody who is kind of gothic and likes, the skull and crossbones, they are going to be more likely to see a skull than a woman looking in the mirror. So let's move on to ambiguity or ambiguous. So a person may assume you understand the implicit meaning, and this creates ambiguity. Ambiguous means that a word or phrase is open to more than one interpretation, and it potentially having multiple meanings. Some authors or speakers intentionally use ambiguous language to confuse or mislead the reader or listener. And, what we see generally are politicians who engage in this kind of behavior. However, usually ambiguous language is accidental or unintentional. And here we have 3 examples. On the left, no parking violators will be towed. Woohoo! That means you're not going to get towed. Yeah, but we all kind of know in our little hearts, despite what the sign says, that we will get towed. In the center picture, we have a chicken who is ready to eat, meaning he's got his knife and fork and he's waiting for his chicken parm to be put down in front of him. Finally, on the right-hand side is a magazine cover where Rachel Ray, who's on the Food Network, finds inspiration in cooking her family and her dog, meaning Is she cooking her family and her dog, or is she cooking for her family and her dog? These are accidental ambiguities, and unless you have a serious concern that Rachel Ray is a cannibal or enjoys dog meat, most of us assume we know what they mean. One of the issues we often see with ambiguity is abstract words. Abstract words or phrases reflect ideas or characteristics or qualities. They're not concrete. So if you say to somebody, that guy is wearing a blue shirt, we know to look for somebody wearing a blue shirt. However, if somebody says, hey, that guy is wearing a cool shirt, my meaning for cool and your meaning for cool might be completely different. So words like love, hate, success, freedom, loyalty, and morality can be defined in a multitude of ways, depending upon the person using the word or the context of the word. So as an example, at 5 years old, your favorite food might have been cheesy poofs. However, by age 20, you may have actually moved on to loving an actual person. Doesn't mean that your love for the cheesy poofs meant any less to you at age 5. It's just we define abstract terms differently as we age and as we have various experiences. So you could say to somebody, I hate you, and then 2 hours later you're telling them that you love them. And again, it's the context, it's the filter we have. You always have to think about how the other person's perspective potentially is different than yours. So here is an example of an abstract term, obscenity. So if you look in the dictionary, obscenity means extremely offensive. And then, according to the Supreme Court, in the case of Miller v. California in 1973, the definition of obscenity is anything that lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. And of course, who then defines that value? Well, according to the Supreme Court, it's the community, which makes it equally ambiguous. So we have a picture here on the left. It's a naked woman who is sleeping on a couch. And the question then is, do you consider this picture to be obscene? You may not like the way that she's lying naked. You may find her size offensive. You may find the pattern on the couch offensive. But here's the reality. This is a famous painting by Lucian Freud. It is a portrait called Benefit Supervisor Sleeping, and it was painted in 1995, and it was sold in 2008 in New York for almost $34 million, setting a world record auction price for a living artist. So, one person might find this extremely obscene, whereas somebody else is going to spend $34 million because they see it as a great work of art. Another way of looking at obscenity is that what offends you may not offend someone else. And it's a matter of perspective. Each person filters experiences differently. And more importantly, every community has different standards. We're all different. So, you go to some small towns and they think dancing is obscene. Other communities think that women who leave their house without a male escort is obscene. Then you have some groups that think tattoos are obscene. And some religious communities think that war is obscene. So obscene is such an abstract term that it can be defined in literally hundreds of ways. It is, however, a good example of what an individual's perspective is. Another example of an abstract term and how it can be ambiguous is the word natural. So we have a conversation between Miguel and Carmen. Miguel says, solar cell panels are a natural way of generating energy without burning fossil fuel. So the government should be investing in them much faster. Carmen, on the other hand, says, natural, you've got to be joking. They're the most artificial monstrosities you ever saw, a blot on the landscape. So they're using the term natural in different ways. So Miguel sees the sun as a natural energy source, whereas Carmen sees the solar cell panels, and you'll see a picture of them on the bottom of the slide, as being so ugly they ruin the landscape. Now, they're both using the word natural correctly. However, the ambiguity of this conversation can be very confusing because they're using the word natural correctly. Advertising relies heavily on ambiguity. So, this is a product that most of us have seen. It is airborne, which is supposed to help you not get sick. They recommend you take it when you're on airplanes and fun stuff like that. Now, let's look at what the expert says. David Shart from the Center for Science in the Public Interest has said, quote, there's no credible evidence that what's in airborne can prevent colds or protect you from a germy environment. Airborne is basically an overpriced, run-of-the-mill vitamin pill that has been cleverly but deceptively marketed. So let's look at the box. Now, at the top of the box on the left, you'll see a gold stamp, and it says Airborne Guarantee. Well, that gold stamp automatically tells us it's a good product because when we see a gold medal, we generally think winner. Now, in the middle, you'll see created by a school teacher. And of course, we trust school teachers. We know that they're good people. And more importantly, we know they're around germy little kids all day. Then you see the actual promotional part of this. Helps support your immune system. Well, it doesn't say that it stops you from getting sick. And the reality is, if you get 8 hours of sleep a night, that's going to help your immune system much more than a run-of-the-mill vitamin pill. So, what you see here is a company that has paid out $23 million in fines for deceptive advertising. But they make over $150 million per year on the product. So, it's just an expense of doing business when they lie to their customers. Here's some more ambiguous advertising. We'll look at the cereal on the left. You'll notice that up at the top it says clinically shown to improve kids' attentiveness by nearly 20%. Wow, that's impressive, right? We're all going to go run out and get some Frosted Mini Wheats. However, when you read what it actually says after the asterisk, based upon independent clinical research, kids who ate Kellogg's Frosted Mini Wheat cereal for breakfast had up to 18% better attentiveness 3 hours after breakfast compared to kids who ate no breakfast. So this number is just being manipulated. Because you could give a kid a Pop-Tart and gummy bears for breakfast, and that's going to help them more than if they get nothing for breakfast. So, this is really ambiguous advertising. On the right-hand side, we have Trident gum. Sugarless gum is good for your teeth, because that's what all the dentists tell us. And it goes on to say it's a fact. 4 out of 5 dentists surveyed would recommend Trident for their patients who chew gum. So does this mean that they only asked 5 dentists? Did they ask 100 dentists? Are they recommending that people should chew gum because it is good for their teeth? So this ad has all kinds of weird ambiguities, and the reality is that when you go to your dentist, they yell at you for chewing gum all the time. On the bottom right, we have Cascade, and the ad says, gets dishes virtually spotless. The advertiser hopes we remember the word spotless and forget the word virtually, meaning almost, which pretty much every dishwashing powder or liquid makes things almost spotless. So again, these are all these ambiguous things that are used in advertising, and if nothing else, when you go to the grocery store, pay a little more attention to these kinds of things, because you may be spending money that you don't need to spend on things that are not really as helpful as they are marketed to be. The intent behind the ambiguity is important, because remember, most times, especially in everyday conversation, ambiguity is an accident. However, when ambiguity affects the justification of an argument, it is known as equivocation. Equivocation is the use of ambiguous language to conceal the truth or to avoid committing oneself. So, in a nutshell, equivocation means you're lying. So now, look at the cartoon on the bottom here. We have the first panel. The guy says, fizzy drinks contain many calories. Then in the second panel, calories are energy. Then energetic people are healthy. And his conclusion being, therefore, fizzy drinks are health drinks. And of course, we know that's poppycock. But the point is that, people who really understand how to manipulate words, use words as a justification for oftentimes absurd arguments. And as a consequence to that, we know now that they're lying. So let's talk about how to analyze implicit meaning and ambiguity. Context is defined as the circumstances, and they provide clues as to the implicit meaning. So when we are trying to figure out what the heck somebody is saying, we're going to look at the following elements to try and cut through the ambiguity. We have to look at the writer's or speaker's background and beliefs, and we've talked about this prior. If somebody works for a conservative think tank or a liberal think tank, that's going to help us figure out what side of the coin they're on. Also, there are traditional uses of words or phrases within the framework of the argument. And remember, the equation is the argument is the conclusion plus reasons. So you look for the conclusion, you try and identify the reasons, and that'll give you an idea of what the argument is. Also, look at the statements immediately prior and right after the ambiguous statement, because oftentimes that'll give us a clue as to their ultimate meaning. And then also, and this should be used 100% of the time, is use logic and reason to figure out what they're talking about. So here's some examples of ambiguous statements. The first one, the turkey is ready to eat. Now, if we're all sitting around a Thanksgiving dinner table, well, clearly that means the turkey is out of the oven, it smells awesome, and we're all going to sit down and chow. Or if you live on a farm, maybe it's feeding time for the turkeys. Second example, we saw her duck. Now, does this mean that a girl bent over to avoid getting hit? Or does she have a pet waterfowl that she walks around the park? And there's not enough context, of course, to figure this out. The third example, a recent study showed that soda drinkers are turning to water. So the question is, are people who drink soda literally turning into a puddle of water, or does it mean that people who drink soda are choosing water more often? In this context, again, what we see here is that the soda drinkers are probably not turning into puddles of water, because we're using reason and logic here. And this way we can say, definitely can say that people are not turning into a puddle of water. Another issue we have to look at when we see manipulation of meaning is something called emotional language. And this is when we use certain words to evoke specific emotions, such as disgust or approval. So in the example, she is slender versus she is emaciated, we can see that slender is a positive word and emaciated is a negative word. And this, again, will have an impact on how we react to these statements. Another statement, the boy ran from the playground versus the boy fled from the playground. And, in this context, somebody who flees, that's a very negative context. And that negative emotion gives you an idea that this young man might have committed a crime or hurt somebody or done something he shouldn't have. Whereas, kids run around and run from playgrounds all the time, and that's a very neutral emotion. These are often called loaded terms, and they, again, are meant to specifically evoke an emotional reaction. So, for example, we have death taxes versus estate taxes. Well, as soon as we use the word death in anything, that automatically makes us feel weird and we don't want to think about our eventual demise. Whereas estate taxes sounds so much more genteel, like we are, running a giant manor like Downton Abbey. Second example, bureaucrat sounds much worse than public servant. Public servant gives us the idea of somebody who is there to serve the public, whereas a bureaucrat sounds like somebody who would show up with a stormtrooper to arrest you and take you away. Finally, and this is something that's in the news a lot, is the term illegal immigrant. And that sounds way worse than the term undocumented worker. So here are two pictures at the bottom, and they're both farm workers. And which ones are the illegal immigrants and which group are the undocumented workers? Well, of course, it's a trick question because they're both. And it's just a way to really kind of get under a person's skin if they have problems with a particular group, is to use a particular phrase. This is another example. 10 years ago, or more than that now, during Hurricane Katrina, a young man was called a looter while another couple were finding supplies. And what was the difference? Well, as Kanye West said, the young black man was called the looter and the white couple were called the finders. And this is from very important and well-regarded press sites. So, this kind of verbiage or rhetoric is used because, at the time, people see black people as looters and white people as just survivors. And the fact of the matter is both groups, or, the young man and the other couple, are just trying to survive this horrible hurricane. Emotional language is propaganda. That's what it really boils down to. Propaganda is defined as information, especially of a biased or misleading nature, and it's used to promote or publicize a particular political cause or point of view. During World War II, the Nazis had an entire department devoted to creating propaganda. So according to their propaganda, a good Nazi looks like these fine young people in pictures. They're blonde, they're strong, they're healthy, they're in the first full blush of youth. Basically, what you would see in a catalog these days for Abercrombie and Fitch or Hollister. And of course, this is how the Nazis portrayed the Jews. And, whether or not you have any knowledge of what happened during the Holocaust, you can tell who the good guys are and who the bad guys are, according to the Nazis. Now, we, even today, still use propaganda. It's not quite so obvious. And here are some examples. So, on the top left, We have former Vice President Dick Cheney, who accidentally shot his friend in the face after they were drinking while they were out hunting. And the tagline is, just one more reason to vote. And what they're voting on is whether or not to make marijuana legal in Colorado. Their point being implied that smoking pot is safer than drinking. On the top right, you have Jesse Kelly for Congress. He's a U.S. Marine combat veteran. He's standing there looking very manly with his large gun. And the tagline is, send a warrior to Congress. Doesn't tell you what he stands for, doesn't tell you what his political affiliation is, doesn't tell you what his plans are. All we really get is a guy standing there with a giant gun. And the tagline, warrior, is in the biggest letters. Finally, on the bottom here, it says, Obama can't run on that record. Well, they don't actually tell us what record they're talking about. And this is about as ambiguous as you can get. So if you are someone who dislikes Obama, you don't care what they're talking about. Anything on his record is going to be offensive to you. Whereas, your average person, if there's a particular issue they don't like about Obama, that's what immediately comes to mind. So, that finishes up this week's presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to email or text me, and I hope you have an awesome day.